So I'm going to go ahead and get going. Thank you for taking time to join us at the Rare Rounds is what we're calling them, and we're excited to have a discussion about developing legal agreements in research collaborations. Before we officially kick off, I have to review a few housekeeping notes. So first of all attendees are muted right now to just reduce any interruptions. But we're going to unmute you in a moment if we have less than 15 participants, just to encourage you to share your questions verbally as well as in the chat box. Let's keep it to an intimate group. If you have some background noise, we would just appreciate you staying mute when you're not speaking. And we just ask that you don't interrupt or speak over other participants and just communicate respectfully, of course, if different opinions arise. So in the interest of making us all feel more comfortable and connected for this discussion, we were hoping that everybody would turn on their videos if you're comfortable with that. And then we encourage you all to participate in this session as active listeners and take advantage of an opportunity to hear from these great leaders and experts around the square. The program is really your opportunity to learn and get answers on critical challenges in rare disease research. So I'm really pleased to introduce and welcome our discussion leaders, Emily Milligan from the Barth Syndrome Foundation and Imran Babar from Cydan, and they'll teach us a little bit and share a more complete background as we delve into the conversation. But for now, we're going to have Emily start us off. So welcome, Emily.
Thanks, Susan. I'm really pleased that all of you made it to a call about legal agreements in the afternoon, midweek. So thank you for joining. I'm Emily Milligan. I'm Executive Director for Barth Syndrome Foundation. My background is in public health, primarily the administrative side of research. I was in epidemiology at Columbia University for several years, and then went on to lead research administration at JDRF. And JDRF is the largest nonprofit funder of type 1 diabetes. That was a really big portfolio. It was about a $500 million portfolio, and all agreements spanned the entire heterogeneity of research, let's say that. After that position, I then moved to Boston, where I started a venture philanthropy fund. That is the T1D fund. It's an $85 million fund, and whereby we would take private capital and invest in early stage companies developing novel products for type 1. After I launched that, I then found myself here in the rare disease world, and I'm really interested, I've been here about 2 years, in propelling a new market within rare disease. And it's an interesting space. I look forward to sharing some of my lessons that I've learned over the course of my career. Imran?
Great, hi. Yeah, so my name is Imran Babar, and also want to extend my thanks for joining. And thanks to Global Genes and to Susan for inviting me to be a part of this roundtable. So I am currently the Chief Business Officer at Cydan, which is an orphan drug accelerator. So essentially it's a company creation engine in which we provide a home for assets.
Right. Sorry, Imran, I had to mute everybody because we got so many participants so quickly.
Oh, okay.
When I muted all, it included you. So I'm really sorry about that, but please continue.
No problem, no problem. So I'm also the acting CBO of one of Cydan's spin-out companies called Tiberio Therapeutics. And Tiberio is an orphan endocrinology company, clinical stage company. Prior to my time at Cydan, I was actually in venture for a number of years. I worked at OrbiMed Advisors, which is a healthcare investment firm in New York, and they have a few different verticals for investing in healthcare companies. I specifically supported the venture capital efforts there. I also spent some time in equity research. I worked at Cowen, which is a mid-sized investment bank based out of New York, and was there covering biotech stocks for a number of years. And I have a basic science background, so I was trained as a molecular biologist, a PhD from Yale. And it was really at the end of my graduate work that I became aware of some of the needs specifically in the rare disease space. And I got involved in co-founding a nonprofit called Rare Genomics Institute. And Rare Genomics initially focused on providing a means to help rare disease patients get a diagnosis for their condition. So we used a crowdfunding model, and we basically connected undiagnosed patients with institutions. And ultimately, we have a great collaboration now with Illumina to be able to sequence patients and try to identify if there are any variants of that would describe or underlie their condition. We've expanded from there to now do patient advocacy, as well as a number of efforts to promote research specifically for rare diseases. So that's actually what ended up leading me to my work at Cydan, which is focused on rare diseases.
So I was gonna just start, we want this to be a dialogue with everybody, right? And I think the funny thing, Imran and I were speaking when we were starting and trying to talk about some of the topics we wanted to bring to the table today, since it is a round table or a square table, as Susan was saying, was the fact that this is about legal agreements and neither one of us is a lawyer. So if you have a JD, you probably should be leading this, but this is really coming from a perspective of we are not lawyers. However, we are responsible for getting the deals done, right? And in the best interest of our constituents and our business and our company or foundation that we represent. So my advice is recognize you're not a lawyer. Don't play a lawyer. Hire yourself a lawyer if you need that at some point in the legal process. So just to put that out there for everybody.
Yeah. No, and I would agree with that. And I think that, and I think I'll defer to Susan to kind of guide us through some specific questions that would that kind of get us kicked off. But maybe it's a couple of remarks, to start off. So first of all, there are obviously different types of legal agreements, everything from, a basic CDA to an MTA. We actually do a lot of sponsored research agreements especially with academic institutions, license agreements. Cydan actually does a lot of option agreements actually. And each of these agreements all have sort of, somewhat different foci in terms of what they're looking to do. But I think that, what I've typically found, especially where, the agreements that are ultimately going to establish a collaboration where we're actually trying to do research, we're trying to do a project together, is that there tends to be a bit of a shift in terms of, really focusing on, all the, crossing your T's and dotting your I's, and in terms of covering yourself from a legal perspective, a shift to sort of more of a collaborative approach, right? Where you're really looking to work with an organization, whether it's a nonprofit, with an academic institution, to really advance a project. And I think that, there's a balance between focusing on sort of the business side of what you're actually trying to do, and then also trying to cover yourself and protect yourself. And sometimes we found that, there can be cases where you can almost be a super lawyer, and, you can end up focusing on spending a lot of time on points that really don't matter that much. And I think that, so one of the things I would say is that, really understanding the business conduct and making sure that your counsel understands the business aspect of what you're doing, so you don't end up going down these rabbit trails that, really don't have much relevance to what you're doing. So I think having that perspective. On the other side of that, I think that the lawyers are really crucial, because I think you're coming from a business perspective, you may not always be aware of, well, what are some of the liabilities that you might have? So really striking that balance between protecting yourself and then focus, but also not going down a rabbit trail that's going to get you bogged down. And the other point that I was just going to mention in terms of just providing some context, one of the things that I found, this is really from a business perspective, so not really necessarily going from the legal perspective when it comes to the agreements. But I think there's kind of a few different things that we typically will focus on. One is ownership, in terms of ultimately whether it comes to IP or it comes to an asset. So really having, who owns a particular molecule or IP. The second really comes down to control, and ultimately who's in the driver's seat as you're doing the research, as you're prosecuting patents, for example. One of the big things I think that comes up is freedom to operate. So I think ultimately really wanting to make sure that you have freedom to operate on the business side. And the third part is economics, and I think that's pretty obvious, just in terms of what are the amounts, what are the conditions, what are the time frames in which the economics will be met. So ultimately, those are kind of the three things I typically will tend to focus on. There are a lot of other things, obviously, as well, that will come up, like termination, right, et cetera. But I think really making sure that you don't lose the forest for the trees as you're kind of navigating through that. So I'll stop there in terms of just some basic points. But
so I think that that's great advice when you talk about the balance. So help us figure out the balance between what you include in the agreement that could maybe be more of a hurdle than a protection. Evaluating the risk versus in various scenarios. Do one of you want to take a stab at that one?
I can take a stab. So it really depends on the agreement, right? It can be and because I'm in the nonprofit space, we work a lot with early stage science, so grants, and then hopefully we get to that translational component, or we can bring in an industry partner, and then it changes, right? Then you're looking at a much different type of agreement. And so just to highlight, like you will deal with MTAs, confidentiality agreements, grant agreements. If you're in the equity space, there could be that as well, in which you're making investments. There are many different types of things that you could consider. When it comes to some of the things that you want to have, and a little bit about the rabbit hole, I'm gonna answer this in way of early stage, and I'll let Imran probably highlight some of the later stage considerations. So early stage, when you have a grant, we were trying to catalyze and bring in people. Like, so many of us in rare disease, we're trying to attract people to our space. We don't want to create any hurdles that de-incentivize them for looking at or spending some of their FTE, their percent effort, in, for example, Barth syndrome, right? We have less than 200 people in the United States, 300 people worldwide. We are actively trying to find people who will work in this space. So we want to incentivize them, not create hurdles. And that is, so you don't want to get into IP discussions. You don't want to, anything that feels like you might push them away. I have found in this space, people really want to just be welcoming and operate in good faith. Now, this is a call about legal agreements. I would highly advise you to not do that. I would say you need to get good grant agreements in place. The universities, they have a certain threshold for language and IP, for example, or reporting requirements back to the foundation. Those are standards that are widely accepted. Lean on your neighbors, lean on your peers and not create redundancy in way of cost and your own human resources to create new agreements. We already know those universities will accept those terms, use them. So that would be a way I would approach that from the early stage. Now, when you start doing multi-party agreements with industry or for-profit entities, then it can get a little trickier. And that's where you might have options, you might have other considerations that, particularly when it comes to royalties and the finances, right? That could be more challenging to navigate. Imran, I'm gonna let you speak more about the later stage development and how that may be reflected in legal agreements as well.
Sure. No, I completely agree with what Emily said. I think that was really, really good. And I think, I'm just kind of thinking back to, just some specific examples of some of the things that we found. One of the most obvious ones, obviously, is I think that, when it comes to, I think really understanding what industry standards are as far as economics are concerned based upon the stage of the program. I think that that's really important. I think sometimes, in dealing with, and sort of working with academic institutions, we found that sometimes there might be a PI professor who's involved, and they might have sort of different expectations in terms of what's involved in terms of, a sponsor, a company taking on and sort of advancing a particular program. So I think really making sure that there's a good understanding there. And then I think for the most part, I think most tech transfer offices are getting pretty professionalized in terms of understanding what the standards are in terms of royalty rates, et cetera, and are becoming, more and more industry friendly, I think. That's not always the case. So I think that that's just something to be aware of and to understand, what is an appropriate royalty rate, for example, what are appropriate milestones, for your program. I've also seen the opposite, actually. I have worked with with advocacy organizations. And I think that, in some ways, they're we actually almost encourage them to think more about, okay, well, what kind of economics can you get actually, of which are reasonable. And I think that even so, I have a nonprofit as well. So we're thinking about, we want to be able to have a sustainable business model so that we can fund the work that we're doing and going forward. So what are some things that we can do? So, there are times where I'm like, thinking about from the advocacy's perspective is saying, okay, well, you can actually ask for more economics than what you have. So I think the point is really understanding what industry standards are with respect to the economics. There are a lot of things, for example, just like time frames for, reporting requirements. There's sort of like things that kind of, it will come up. At the end of the day, it's a negotiation in terms of what really makes sense. I think that if you're too onerous in terms of, you want monthly updates or, even quarterly updates, I think can be a bit burdensome. I think that, what I found at least is something like, a couple times a year, there's sort of a formal update. But then again, as I said in the very beginning, if it's more of a collaboration, you are just going to have regular communication. Like, you're going to be checking in every couple of weeks and just kind of, giving updates. And again, it's viewed more as a collaboration, and you're basically wanting to seek each other's, guidance on certain aspects of the project. So again, I think a lot of that, can transition in that way. I think, and this is just like, kind of, again, more probably of a one-off. One of the things that I found is, for example, in an agreement, really a provision, for example, to prohibit the partner from taking on additional government money or grant money. So, well, why would you have that in there? And I think that at the end of the day, we said, no, we don't need to include this. We just struck it because we just didn't think it was meant a lot. But the concern was margin rights, right? Where basically, sort of, if you have any sort of responsibilities, or basically due to non-performance or non-reporting of some sort of violation of U.S. manufacturing, that basically the government could essentially step in, and then sort of your rights to a certain IP would be limited. And so concerns around that. So but again, so understanding the ultimate business case, for us, we said, what, that's such a low risk and such a low probability in this particular case, we just didn't think that it was necessary to put that sort of, to be heavy-handed in that manner. So there are different examples like that will come up. Yeah, so maybe I'll stop there. I'm happy to give clarification on any of that, what I just mentioned. But
yeah, well, so Imran, you talked about considerations, from an industry perspective about working with an advocate group versus what an advocate might want to take into consideration when working with industry. So you've a few things, but is there anything else that you could add to that? Considerations that each party needs to keep in mind as they pursue a partnership with the other?
Sure, absolutely. So I would say that really with Cydan and Tiberio is that we actually really do like working with advocacy groups, and I think that there are a few things that are really crucial for us as we're working, especially as we're going into sort of a different area. And I think one of the things that Cydan has is that we do tend to have a real breadth of knowledge and a breadth of experience in different disease areas. And I think that we have deep knowledge in certain areas that we spent time in. But I think that a lot of times the advocacy organizations, they'll have deep knowledge about a particular disease area. And so I think that even from understanding, the basic science, a lot of times they'll have researchers, or, they have connections to the key opinion leaders in a particular area, and being able to access that knowledge. A lot of times we have, again, good relationships, and we'll just shoot somebody an email, say, hey, we came across, this general approach. What do you think of this? Is something that there's a path to smell test for you. So understanding the mechanism of action, et cetera. Also from the clinical side, I think, a big part for us is really understanding, what matters to a patient. And when you think about designing a clinical trial and the endpoints that you'll include in the clinical trial, I think really being able to understand that is very important. And so I think that's something that the advocacy groups are, really, provide a lot of insight for us on that. And then I think we can come in and provide this sort of the industry perspective in terms of really how to advance it, how to, even deal with, navigate the regulatory pathway, et cetera, get the capital for the program. But I think that those are really, key considerations for us. So yeah, and I think the other thing is, the whole part about, I think from an advocacy organization's perspective, a lot of times they really want to ensure that if they're partnering with somebody, that that their partner is moving the program along, that it's not just going to sit there and, Emily, correct me if I'm wrong on this, but I think that is a really key consideration. And I think that, so I think from our perspective, I think, we, especially when working with advocacy organizations, I think that we want to be able to provide, regular updates and just making sure, and then defining, what are the milestones that we expect to achieve, and in what time frame. And I think that's important to be able to outline, especially as you're working with advocacy organizations, just again, to make sure that everyone's expectations are really on the same page with that. So I think that's another, important consideration. You have this sort of the provision of, using commercially reasonable efforts. And I think that that's pretty standard language. The truth is that it's really hard to sort of, from a legal perspective, to show that a partner has not used CRE to advance their program. So I think that's where, I would underscore the importance of being able to really, understand the timeline. What are the expectations? Realize that there's going to be some fudge factor in that, as you think about, those partnerships. So let me stop there, but.
Yeah, so I'll add, the CRE is really important. I mean, you'll see that in every single agreement, but you're right. It's very hard to prove it. So if you were to get litigious, it would be very difficult. And so the way I want to frame this, kind of going back to one of the things that we started with, which is legal agreements are just about negotiation, and you exercise negotiation every day in your life. And this is just a different realm in which you're going to be operating with that principle, right? So you know what you want. And if you don't know what you want, you need to talk to people like us, because we'll tell you what you need to want. And you know what you want, and then you know what you're willing to accept, up until what point. And then somewhere in here is probably where you're going to land with your agreement. And even though it might be on paper, you'll still need to manage the relationship. And so, yes, you can't rely on CRE that this program is going to advance, like a Hail Mary, right? You have to be engaged with your collaborator at the table with them as a partner. And I want to highlight something else. We were talking about industry, and we refer to it as like the human race. It's just one thing, but it's quite heterogeneous, right? You've got publicly traded companies, you've got small biotech, small pharma, some companies are virtual, right? There's a lot of different animals in that zoo, and they all have different corporate culture, different values. So when you find an industry partner, you still need to go through the process of evaluating, like, do I want to be in a relationship with them? Because you're going to be working with them for a while. You'll have to work through some of the technical aspects together. Hopefully they are inviting you to those discussions. Regarding like endpoints, for example, will they want to listen to your organization and hear the patient perspective when designing a trial? I can tell you, I've got a short list of people I don't want to work with because they don't want to hear the patient's perspective. Now that is changing a lot in industry. I think there's been a huge push to be inclusive of patients. It's been a very big shift. I think if you look back even 10 years ago, there wasn't an advocacy representative in many publicly traded companies, right? It is an emerging career, so to speak. And I think it's good because it creates that liaison with the nonprofit. But just be cautious in that when you're evaluating, when you're working through some of this, you have to know what you want, where you have to draw a line. And I've had that happen. I've had people from industry say to me, for example, especially small companies, that they're worried about the valuation of their company. And if there's any negative press that comes out on a study, then they don't want that. They were trying to get that struck from saying that an embargo, right? You can't publish any negative findings. And we said, well, that's counter to our principles. That's counter to the principles of working with academia, which was another third party in this arrangement, whereby we have to stimulate knowledge. That's their core value of academia. So understanding what you can ask for, where you need to draw the line, and then negotiating within that to get it on paper, but don't underestimate the relationship management that'll have to come afterwards, and evaluate if that partner will be is the right person, is the right industry partner to be working with you long term.
Thanks, Imran and Emily. So we had a few questions in the queue about kind of industry standards, and Julie had the first question, so I've unmuted her and I'll let her ask the question directly. And then
Okay.
if people kind of added on to that.
Thank you so much, Susan. And this is a really, really great session. Imran, I think I've actually met you before on a phone call, so great to see you again. And such a great topic. I actually wasn't really thinking through the group I was coming into and was thinking this might be more about the business side than the legal side. It's great that it's about the legal side. My question's a little bit more on the business side, which is really for the small rare disease advocacy organizations that have developed a data, a database and are able to provide data and some data analysis and have a lot of sort of an intellectual kind of brain trust of knowledge about their disease and great contacts with KOLs and potential PIs, often globally. Our ability to know how to price our expertise and to know in order to keep doing this work and to keep it going, we need a business model that pays us to do this work. But I haven't found any sources yet of how do we know what our value is? How do we know how to price ourselves? And when our industry partners have been great and they've been very accepting of our terms. So this isn't a dig at all at them. It's knowing, oh, are we charging enough for this more? And probably not. So what would you advise?
Well, yeah, I mean, I can start off. I can at least try to start off. I think that, it's a really good question. And I think that, one of the things that, yeah, as you said, from the business side, we're always, looking for what are the best comps and what are the best standards that we can reference. I think that, without knowing the specifics in terms of the database that you have and the particulars there, I think that there, some of the terms you can find in terms of some of the publicly announced agreements that are done, but a lot of times I think you're right. It's going to be hard to find a lot of those terms publicly. Sometimes they will mention, these economics were paid. But I think that, what we found actually is even sometimes our counsel will, because they've done a number of these agreements, they'll have a pretty good sense in terms of, this is really, industry, this is industry standard, this seems within realm for what I've seen. And so sometimes, again, getting a good lawyer actually can help in that case in terms of understanding the terms, because I think you're right. A lot of times they just aren't publicly announced in terms of the specific terms, in terms of what you're getting. So I think that, one, in terms of thinking about, what you typically can find, you can find better comps in terms of, if there's like a specific patent or there's a specific asset that a company has. And you can kind of try to think about, well, how does what you have, the package that you have, compared to like an asset or compared to a patent, and try to draw those comparisons, and based upon that, you can sort of think about, well, what is a relative value that your data package is providing. So that's another way to do it, sort of trying to draw those lines to what you do have from the publicly available sources. Those are my off the cuff thoughts on that. I think there's no sort of database that you can log into that just specifically tracks all these things, but those are kind of the ways that I would think about trying to triangulate onto that. Emily, anything to add to that? Or
Yeah, I mean, I would say, again, the caveat being the quality and quantity of the data in your database, and what you're capturing longitudinally, cross-sectionally, like just all of those considerations, which really change
matter. Right. Natural history, looking at natural history.
I figure, right? History is kind of the buzzword, natural history. I would say you talk to peer organizations who have similar databases, right? That you can capture what are you following, right? For natural history. And then some of them, I mean, I've just found my peer organizations to be really, really helpful in thinking through pricing. What data do I give them? What are the conditions in which I give them this data? Do I have an independent biostatistician review and answer the questions so that I keep division of church and state here? So I think that's one of the things that we've used, right, to mitigate that risk and create that buffer, so to speak. The other thing I was just, Imran said was, if you get good counsel, if you get
Yeah, good
counsel that has
counsel.
experience, it's worth its weight in gold. I've had boards come to me and say, oh, but we have so-and-so who's a JD, right?
Right. Well, that's what
And
we've been doing. That's honestly what we've been doing. And she's been great, but
there's a
doesn't know
but.
this.
There's a but.
Yeah.
And I mean, lawyers specialize in so many different areas of law.
Yeah.
You really need to find someone, and you can even do that. If they are a lawyer in a large firm, they'll probably have a partner who specializes in an area that is relevant to you, right?
Absolutely.
And sometimes they'll be willing to pick up the phone and say, hey, can you help me out here? I found that to be helpful, as long as they're humble enough to recognize this is outside of their area of expertise and depth. But that's a way to get free advice by leveraging your network. Makes your volunteer feel good. You get the right advice instead of just somebody with the credentials, the letters after their name, which it's important, but it can lead you, to Imran's prior point, down a rabbit hole that is not productive, and it can actually jeopardize your brand, because if people see you as onerous to work with, not really savvy in what you should ask for and how much, they're not going to want to work with you. So that's peer organizations, and then leveraging your network to try to access pro bono, but the right expertise.
The right pro bono, Great. Yeah, great advice. Thank you.
We have a question from Monica. I'm going to unmute her in a second to ask you. She's looking for, is there a list of like health policy lawyers, contract lawyers, that that help?
It's because we're right now, actually we're constructing our first sharing project agreement with an academic institution. And I know of maybe a couple attorneys. I know one in New York that does this, and of course he's close to about $2,500 an hour. Because these are like really incredibly specialized attorneys that deal with the health documents. I was looking, I thought I saw Candace on there. I know Candace is an attorney. Hi, Candace. She has helped us a little bit when she was on our board, walk us through some of these agreements. But now we're finding that our data is incredibly valuable, and depending on the project, I don't know if many of you are familiar with the cystic fibrosis model that they used, and it took 10 years, but they had an agreement put in place way before they started a process of even finding a molecule, because they used that data. And so we are trying to model that same exact process that they did, because you might not know if something's going to come from your data, but you need to have all of these agreements executed by an attorney, or something's going to get left out. You're not going to get part of the royalties. Like, I know that cystic fibrosis gets, I think 1 or 2% of the royalties of the drug that came about out of that to go back into the community. So I'm just wondering if there is a list of good health policy contractual attorneys, because like Emily was saying, it takes a special person to do this. And is there a resource somewhere where organizations like ours can go to shop for certain situations, I guess?
Lawyer.com.
Well, I think it's a good question, like the shopping component, right? I mean, sometimes we just get a name and we think I've got a name, so I should work with them. I have a feeling I know who you're talking about for $2,500. Very good lawyer.
Worth the money, but it's a lot of money.
It's a lot of money, and a deal can cost you $50,000, right? Mm-hmm. And I've paid those invoices. They're not fun. So I would advise that you do shop. And the best way I've done it in sourcing really great lawyers is just talking to other organizations and then doing some interviews. They're commonly willing to give an hour of their time because they know that if they can seal that retainer, that they're going to be around for a while, and it's going to be well worth that investment. And it's worth yours also. I'm happy to share, like, for example, who I work with. I work with two different firms. I won't share it on this call, but I work with two different firms, just to be very clear. One that's more general counsel and works with my confidentiality agreements, my grant agreements, some IP. But then I work with another lawyer that's specialized in equity and royalty-based agreements. And they are, I think they could both kind of do each other's job, but I wanted that specialization in those different areas. And I have found there's some very good lawyers who are willing to give you discounts because they're in the business, their reputation's on the line, and I don't think they need to charge $2,500 an hour.
Yeah, and I think that's really good. I think I would really echo what Emily just said, and I think that a couple of points. I think one, for in terms of how we think about the different counsel that we use. There's really got three different areas that we typically have, and we actually have three different groups that we work with. Actually, four, I would say. So, one is on the contracting side, so license agreements, option agreements, those sorts of agreements. So we have a group that we work with specifically on contracts. We have another group that we work with specifically on IP. And again, it's a totally different firm on IP. And then we have a third one that we specifically work with on corporate matters. So, for example, when it comes to equity financing, when it comes to just those sort of corporate matters. The fourth one I would say is somebody that does just kind of works with us on sort of relatively more simple agreements. And again, sort of at this is just sort of an independent independent practice, as somebody who just gives us a good rate and is able just to quickly kind of flip through CDAs with us, that sort of thing. And so those are kind of the difference. So basically, I think the point that Emily made about specialization, different lawyers, and I think, as she said, a good lawyer will be able to tell you, straight away if they have the experience or not. There was another example. We were working on the contracting side, and a lawyer said, what, we don't really have the direct experience here, even though it is kind of contracting related. This is very specialized. For example, it's really very particular to government sort of, government grant issues. And so then they recommended somebody else that we could work with. So that's something that I would highlight. The other part about paying, $2,500 sounds very, very pricey for me. And I think that, what I would say is that there are different ways. For example, and again, this maybe comes to, for example, if you don't have a lot of capital, there's, maybe you're a startup. There are some lawyers that will actually take sort of deferred comp in some ways. So, for example, they'll kind of take equity in the company. Again, we're in a company creation model, and we have worked with groups that, we're willing to defer it because again, I think there's sort of that trust, that there's that relationship that we've had for many, many years. And so I think that, they're willing to work with us. And again, these are probably more established. They're not necessarily sort of short for cash per se. And they say, what, that's fine. We can defer it. We can take equity, that sort of thing. I'd say if you're in the company creation business, be very, very careful about who you promise equity to, because, I think you want to be very thoughtful about that. But just know that there are different models that people work with. There are also law firms that sort of have sort of, I guess, reduced their overhead. And as a result, in the fact that they've been able to reduce their overhead, they're able to give better rates in some ways. And so again, you can Google a list of lawyers. You can just and find lawyers that work with nonprofits and advocacy groups. But the reality is, I can't really vouch for any of the ones that I have not specifically worked with per se. And so that's where I go back to what Emily would say. Talk to people who have worked. You take advantage of your network in terms of getting recommendations. So. I feel like Candace is on, and if anyone who's a lawyer has anything to add to that, I would really appreciate that, because as Emily said, I'm not trained as a lawyer per se. So if anyone has anything to add to that, we really appreciate it.
Candace, do you want to say anything?
Can we unmute her, or it looks like she's muted?
Just unmuted her.
Yeah, I'm happy to talk about it. It's because I am a rare disease patient, but I am also an attorney, and I became an attorney after I was diagnosed with my rare disease. So I work in healthcare, corporate law, compliance, and I work with a lot of pharmaceutical companies and with nonprofits. And so ultimately, the space is hyper specialized. In terms of your 2,500 an hour lawyers, these are lawyers that have been practicing a long time. They're attorneys who deal with extremely complex IP litigation issues, which in some cases, if you're dealing with a novel therapy, especially if you're in the gene therapy space, you may want to, if your group is partnering with someone to develop one of these novel therapies, it may be worth your while to raise the capital to afford that $2,500 an hour lawyer, just in case if there is a litigation issue that comes up. But in general, the advice to look for an attorney who is specialized in the area that you're seeking advice in is critical. And in general, with law school and everything, it depends on where the attorney went to school, what their specializations were, what their focus was as well. There isn't much of a health law education in most law schools. I went to one of the few law schools that did have a specialty in that, and then received a certificate in compliance from another law school just to focus in that area. So I've had people call me and ask me about IP, and I will refer them to somebody that I know that I feel is competent. At the same time, too, I know lawyers at different price points. So like for myself, I'm really lucky because my mother is also an attorney, so we work together. And so the overhead is low. Now, if I went to work for a large firm and I was being hounded to work for a large firm, my hourly rate would have been exponential compared to what I can charge now. And so you have to look at that. So sometimes expensive isn't always the best. It's just that some of the attorneys that you'll meet, especially if you go to conferences and they attend them, they don't set their price, their bosses do. So you have to keep that in mind, and you are paying for the overhead for the fancy law firm on Fifth Avenue or in downtown Washington, D.C. But at the same time, too, it's really critical that if you are engaging in any sort of licensing, business development, sale of data or licensing of data where there could be money involved or it could be monetized, you need to have a set of legal eyes review those contracts. Because unfortunately, I've had a few cases where people have come to me for help after the fact. They didn't seek legal advice and they signed a bad deal. And then they're bound to it. Another thing is that depending on your location, yes, there is an opportunity potentially to give equity in what you're doing to an attorney, but in some states, the bar specifically prohibits that. It becomes an ethical issue for the attorney. And in some cases, there may not be an outlined ethical issue, but the attorney will need to get an ethical opinion from their bar, or the American Bar Association may have opined on that and said, you know what, that's not really a great practice. In one area in particular that's really important about that is if you have an attorney sitting on the board of your nonprofit, that attorney cannot represent your nonprofit. You need to have outside counsel. So you can utilize them as a set of eyes when we're talking about pro bono representation or pro bono legal help. That's a really great way to get sort of an opinion, and they can tell you like, hey, listen, we need to step outside or we need to get outside assistance. And I sat on Monica's board for almost 2 years. And so I was her set of eyes. So when she's positioning now for what she's doing with the SynGap group, a lot of that was, yes, okay, here we go. And these are the projects you're going to need. These are the lawyers. Let's get names. If you're locating attorneys, one of the great things you can do is you can call the state bar and ask them. Unfortunately, a lot of times the state bars, because this is such a specialized, tiny area, probably will say to you, what? Because they're used to getting calls about criminal attorneys or someone to help them with a real estate dispute. But I'm always happy to try to direct people to where they can go to find someone, or if they need a specialized person. I connect with and network with a lot of lawyers in the life science space, and also just in business in general from my dealings within just my everyday practice. So generally we connect with people, and I always keep their cards just in case there may be somebody who needs someone. But in general, lawyers are a good thing. It's a good idea to try to negotiate or ask about a price. But don't be afraid if they're not at a big firm. A lot of times, especially with COVID, a lot of people got laid off from firms. You're going to see most of your large law firms right now, the associates are no longer there. Associates charge a lower hourly rate than the partners. So unfortunately, when you pay for a partner, even though they're really great, they're also really, really expensive.
Thanks, Candace.
Thank you.
So Linda had a question. She's interested in some best practices or industry standards around, was it royalty payments and technology payments, Linda?
Yes, we have a business model where we invest in research and development projects. And so we have so far, it's similar to the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation venture philanthropy model that was raised before, although we're using impact investing, which is slightly different and don't need to spend a bunch of time on that right now. But the point being is that so we've negotiated one deal with a large academic institution and another one with a small biotech. Our terms are very different. I spent my whole career before nonprofit in the for-profit world, so I've negotiated a lot of contracts, but at the same time, I feel like I'm kind of stabbing in the dark of what to ask for. And of course, what we asked for and what then they offer, and we end up somewhere in between. That's negotiation. But I never can quite figure out if we're leaving money on the table and are there resources to kind of guide certain kinds of or sizes or types of projects or investments, and what would be a typical royalty or technology. And then kind of a part of that as well is like sort of when do you move from royalty or technology payments to options, which is a whole different, I mean, obviously depends on who you're working, you know, what the partner is, but I'm kind of curious about that. And then just while I have the microphone, two quick comments on the previous conversation. One is I highly recommend people who are looking for resources, and a little plug here, the Global Genes Foundation Alliance Facebook group is awesome. And I have gotten so many good references and ideas from others, and I don't necessarily know these people, but that group, I have really gotten some good advice. So I highly recommend, if you're not on that, join that, and that's a really good resource. And then secondly, we work with two very, very large law firms. We also work with one individual lawyer, but two very, very large law firms, and we pitched as to why our organization should be their pro bono project. And so we have two really, really large law firms that we get all their services pro bono. We have a very large team. When something else comes up in our organization that is a different type of specialty or law, they bring in the partner and the associates to work on that with us. And I'm not saying it's something everybody's going to be able to do, but it's available. So look into potentially law firms that maybe you have a connection with and find out if they have pro bono. Most law firms do have a pro bono amount of services that they do. So.
And Linda, I'm so glad you brought that up, because a lot of them, you're right, they do have a social responsibility allocation, and some of them have formal ways you can even ask for it. We've also done that as well. The one challenge that I've had, and I hope you've had like a better experience in this sometimes, when it's free, it takes longer. I've just found that it's when they have time to look at it. So just balance cost versus time, because you might pay zero, but you're going to take 4 times as long to get a solution.
Yeah.
But not always, right? Depends on the firm. And
right.
Kind of that.
Yeah.
I'm going to take a stab at your royalty question, and I'll let Imran say if I'm hot or cold. So I would start with, and he'd be like, oh, you're leaving money on the table, or that's way too aggressive, Emily. I would start with 10% of net revenue. Mm-hmm. And now the net is an interesting calculation. Yes. And don't just assume that everybody defines it the same way. So it's important to figure that out up front if possible. I would not negotiate after the fact when they're bringing in millions and then they say, oh, but we had to take this off and with our overhead and this for this and this. Next thing you end up with this amount. So if you define it up front, you might have a much larger denominator to work with. Now, I would say 10% up to 5x of our investment. Imran, how am I doing? How's that sound?
That's good. So you know, I would maybe I should just provide a little bit of background before I specifically comment on 10%. So I think, you know, there are a lot of variables, obviously, you know, and I think that, you know, what is the stage of the asset or the IP that is being licensed, that has a huge impact on what we're talking about. I would also say, you know, in terms of, there's different levers, obviously, in terms of the economics, whether you prioritize more near-term payments, you know, so for example, upfront payments, you know, milestones, near-term milestones, or do you prioritize, you know, recognizing the upside should it be successful? So maybe it might be sort of commercialization milestones or sort of the royalties. So I think that just understanding what your priorities are and realizing that there are different levers that you can pull in terms of, you know, recognizing the economics, right? You know, so again, you know, it's hard to comment on 10% specifically, I think, without knowing.
Let me rephrase it.
Okay.
10% early stage, not late stage. And I'm not talking putting 50% of cash in order to operate. So it's more like a grant mechanism of early stage science.
Yeah. So, and again, I'd be curious if others have a different perspective on this. So, you know, my sense, if it's like in sort of early preclinical stage, that would appear high, I think, for a lot of folks in industry. I think that, you know, when you're talking about sort of, you know, and we have, and so the other thing I think is important to factor is there's sort of different tiers that you can apply as well, right? So you could say, you know, this royalty rate, you know, up until this amount of sales, and then, you know, for sales between this amount and the next amount, there's a higher royalty rate. So you can have these sort of tiered royalties. But again, I think that it's just really hard to say without knowing, you know, what exactly the asset is or what exactly the IP is. I think that, you know, I've seen, you know, royalties, you know, 10% and double digits and going higher. But I think once you start getting, you know, sort of, you know, upwards in the double digits, it becomes, especially for an early stage program, it makes it unattractive from a business perspective. And actually, there's a particular program right now that we're actually looking at where there's double digit royalty rate. And we're basically like, you know what, it's just, you know, we know that our investors are not gonna go for it, because part of what goes into this is the NPV, the net present value from a business perspective. And the thing is, with earlier stage programs, you apply a higher discount rate to the whole thing, right? And so when you have a high royalty rate on top of a high discount rate because of the risk that the perceived risk for an early stage program, you know, you become NPV negative, right? So I think that, again, that discount rate is going to be less for a later stage program. So then I think that, you know, getting into the double digits, I think is more reasonable. But again, I think that it really depends on the specifics. So that's my, and I think that to your point earlier, Linda, I think that a lot of these comps, I think are, you know, especially when it comes to royalty rates, especially if you're talking about, you know, an actual drug like an asset, there are quite a few publicly available comps that you can look at, different deals that have been done. That you'll be able to find sort of what the royalty rates are, what the you know, what the stage of the programs are.
I want to make one more comment quickly on this. It's when we look at leaving money on the table, sometimes we lose perspective of bringing a product to market, right? How does that impact your constituents, their quality of life, et cetera, which as an advocacy, I'm sure you complete this. I'm preaching to the choir here. But that's something that has an immense value, but may not be quantitative, right? And then additionally, if you brought something to market, then you can attract new partners, perhaps, to advance other assets that are in your pipeline. So while you might say, oh gosh, I wish we would have had, you know, 100K in the bank if we had negotiated that differently up front 10 years ago, you know, to Candace's point. Maybe you could have, but the counterfactual is tough to prove, right? And maybe you would never advance that program because it was just too onerous to engage the negative NPV, as Imran was saying. So, I mean, you want to be smart about it, educate yourself, talk to others who have brokered similar agreements, but never lose perspective on the larger mission and what you're trying to achieve, because there could be unanticipated benefits of just getting the deal done.
Thank you. That helps. And I think we're on track based on what both of you said. So that was also good confirmation.
Great.
Great. Fantastic. Okay, so we only have a couple of minutes left because I would love to give you a chance to say something quickly in terms of closing remarks, but could you address pretty quickly, there's different types of agreements. Who do you involve when? Who should be involved when for which type of agreements and throughout the process?
Sure, I can take a stab at that. And also, I saw Steve's question as well, which I think is related to that. Sort of as you're in licensing IP, at what point do you begin some of those discussions? And so I think that, excuse me, for us, at the point, I'd say when we're at the point of, and this is really, I think maybe somewhat specific to the Cydan model, at the point in which we're about to spend money on doing a research project. I think that, before we would, and we don't always do this. Sometimes we will spend money at risk before the agreements are in place, and just part of our desire to try to accelerate things. But I think that, I think this usually sooner is better. I think in terms of understanding, and just outlining, who's responsible for what are the terms, and just basically getting that out of the way with, I think. So I think typically, I would say the sooner the better. And I think that, specifically, what are some of the key considerations in licensing IP? I think that there are a number of things. I think one is, from academic institutions, a lot of times academic institutions will have IP, which is already sort of, for example, issued or granted. And they might actually say, well, you can do an option to that IP. And so basically they'll almost give you sort of a trial period where maybe you're doing research, really trying to validate your approach. And we've seen that before and actually have done these before. And that actually, allows you to limit some of the economics, at least the near-term economics that you're paying for that IP. And then you have the ability to sort of, execute a license at a later date. So that's one thing to keep in mind as well. You might have that option. I think, for example, it might be sponsored research agreements, and where I think that if you're actually paying, an academic institution to do some of the work for you, I think that in sort of collaborative fashion, I think that the economics are going to be different. So understanding, is it sort of background IP that's already established, or are you working with the institution to actually generate new IP for which the economics would actually be somewhat different. I think the other point is that, being aware of the fact that, academic institutions sort of, because they're using sort of public money, ultimately, they're going to have different requirements in terms of disclosure. And this is something that I think, we've had discussions with, because to some degree we've had concerns. Okay, well, we're generating this, this novel data. We don't want it to get out in the public realm before we're able to file IP or to move on it. And so understanding that, that eventually they will have to be able to make that publicly available. So understanding the time frame in order to do that, and sort of, how that relates to the IP that you want to file from the research that's coming from that. Those are just some comments that come off some thoughts that come off the top of my head on that particular question. Emily, anything to add to that, or if we have time?
I know we're out of time. I'll just close very simply. Scientists need to talk first, figure out if there's any potential there. So PhDs talk to PhDs. If they bring in their business person, if Ron's on the phone, I'm gonna be on the phone. If they got legal on the phone, you better have legal on the phone. So make sure you have your own representation at each step along the way there.
Fantastic. Well, thank you, Emily and Imran. This was super helpful, and thanks for those who participated in the discussion and joined in on the chat box. So next up right now at 3:30, from 3:30 to 5:30 Eastern Time, please select the 2020 Cure Accelerator Live for Rare Disease session from the agenda in the auditorium and visit us there. So thanks everyone, and have a great rest of your day, and thanks again for participating.
Thanks everyone, take care.
Bye-bye now.